There's a rumor out there among the Tesla fans and the fans of SpaceX that we might be getting married. We might be putting together a great romance in the future, or the romance I guess is now, and that would mean that Tesla fans would could become Starlink fans and Starship fans and all kinds of things. And so over the course of the last week, I've seen way more conversations on X and elsewhere about the various things over at the SpaceX company. Not that we didn't have enough before, but now there's more. And one of the people that has been leading that charge and has gotten a lot of response from it is our Phil Beisel, who brings us the engineering perspective, and he's going to talk to us this morning about Starlink.
Yeah, Starlink.
Yeah. So I did a little research this morning. I've actually been researching it all week, and it looks like about a $300 billion profit company within 10 years.
It's extraordinary.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you know what? It's interesting. Yeah. Kind of like what you're saying is we got this Tesla fanboyism kind of thing. We all live through a lot of the cool things that Tesla's going to do, and we talk a lot on the show about Tesla. But SpaceX, man, I've been talking about SpaceX for a while, and I love SpaceX. And I think I probably, when I was at Rivian, my love, like, or respect for Elon was mostly about SpaceX.
Right.
So, yeah, it makes sense. And so I wrote an article. It's now over a year plus old, but it's so relevant about Starlink. And just to give you some background, most of my early career in engineering was all in networking,
Mm-hmm.
TCP/IP stuff. So, I was at Apple doing that stuff. I left Apple, started first venture funded startup, my first venture funded startup that was all about wireless communications at tight bandwidth and high latency. So really, I was very excited to try to understand how Starlink itself works
Mm-hmm.
and what there's a lot of necessary physics here to make it work in a certain particular way that makes it seem like terrestrial internet. So that's what we're going to discuss
Okay.
today. What
Cool.
yeah,
Okay.
let's do it. All right. So there's an article you all can read on X called "Starlink is Mind-Blowing," and I totally enjoyed writing this. Really, I mean it was like I could learn how this cool technology worked, and this is going back a bit of time now, and it's completely relevant. And I look at it as you know, Randy, in the early days of networking, when I was involved in that, networking was a physical thing. We had, I mean, Jesus, I was around when token ring existed, which is something you don't want to even know about. And then Ethernet came along, and I worked at Apple, and Apple Talk was the networking protocol, and it was uh, worked on this beautiful coax cable, so you could network the Macs together and quite seamlessly. And around that time in the early 90s, we were experimenting with things that were wireless, and the first wireless links that we experimented with Apple were infrared links, believe it or not. Um, and then we kind of jumped into RF. And this is before Wi-Fi uh, and before cell phones. So, I mean, obviously people know that you could move data wirelessly. It's just that there was no real tech at the time. Now, what would have been the realization of that tech would have been effectively Wi-Fi.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, that's a local based
Mm-hmm.
wireless. But there's a lot of similarities, as we'll discuss in this podcast today, about how the data flows. And how this works. So let's just jump into it.
Sure.
So Starlink, absolutely amazing. I mean, it literally blows me away. I mean, uh, in 2020, I think it launched, as I recall, I think it launched in the first 60 odd satellites were launched in 2019. And it was an experiment, effectively.
Hmm.
And these were low Earth orbit satellites, making it possible to do the thing it does, which we'll describe in gory detail why that is necessary. And then by 2021, Starlink uh, had about 10,000 customers on the network, and now it has about 10 million.
Right.
And look at that growth chart.
Yeah.
I mean, it's insane. It's growing about 1 million subscribers a month, give or take.
Yep. Hmm.
Um, and that's, 10 million. It's a very small number given the potential here. And 10 million, this is 10 million subscribers to Starlink, we'll call it Starlink proper, the service that we know as Starlink, like internet through these transceiver terminals. But Starlink, and we'll discuss this in this presentation, that we'll get into mobile business as well. So now, sky's the limit,
So to speak.
so to speak. I wasn't trying to make the pun, but um, so what is Starlink? It is a satellite-based internet service today. Has about 9,600 satellites. It's high speed and low latency. We'll get into the gory details of that, why that matters. Um, a cool thing is it really works in rural areas, oceans, and Antarctica, and it even works in high dynamic environments like aircraft and rockets. We've seen downlinks from Starship. Uh, People are familiar with taking flights, especially in the United States, over, say, United Airlines, outfitting its fleet with Starlink, and it's becoming something where if you've been on a if you've been on a United flight with Starlink, it's like having internet at home. There's literally no difference.
And you
Uh,
won't ever want to fly without it again.
no, I don't. I don't think so because I mean we all know how people, myself, everyone is incredibly addicted to connectivity
Yeah.
of the device. In other words, people often say, "Well, people look down at their cell phone all the time," but put it in airplane mode and see how useful that device is. It's
Right.
not, right? And people listening here know the second you get on an airplane and you're stuck without uh, internet service, your phone is just a solitaire device.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So you can't do the things I mean, maybe you get the poor services they have today, and maybe you get the free, you know, internet messaging, and you're all excited that you've got the iMessage running or something like that. But you can't browse the web particularly in a fluid, dynamic way. You certainly can't do a FaceTime.
Hmm.
With Starlink, you obviously can do that. So it's a dramatic thing here, and will only get massively better. And we can think that as SpaceX moves forward, every device that Elon builds through Tesla will be Starlink connected. That means most certainly vehicles, most certainly Optimus.
Hmm.
Um, and it will literally, in some ways, obviate the need for terrestrial data flows.
Right.
When I say that, I mean like right now we are wired with a heavy degree of optic fiber sitting, we live off of our Comcast and other types of internet providers. And yes, they provide higher bandwidth services today, but wireless is a magical thing, and I think we all can, to I mean, we can all understand this when we use our mobile devices, but we all can understand this at home too. And as we started the discussion, I said in the 90s we were experimenting at Apple with wireless communication.
Mm.
That meant that the opposite that meant that every other object, every other Macintosh had to be physically wired.
Wired. Yeah. Yeah.
There was no grab a laptop, go sit, in a coffee shop and just join a
Right.
wireless network. You couldn't do things like that. Um, and now, I mean, we take it for granted. Wi-Fi is amazing, frankly.
Yeah.
Cellular, as cellular moved from analog to digital, the whole idea of moving data on those networks is just amazing. Um, and I joined this whole thing when it was incredibly nascent and frankly non-existent.
Right.
The internet itself. I mean, I predated the internet,
Right. Right.
but I mean, I predated wireless, and I experimented. I mean, I worked in advanced technology group at Apple, worked on a product called Newton, and we were doing,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, we were doing. In fact, I have it here.
You have a
This is,
Newton?
yeah, I just looked over. This is a clear case,
Uh-huh.
first generation, given out to the engineering team. Um, this device has no wireless.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I mean, it has uh, you know, a port here for an Apple Talk connection. That
Sure.
was
Sure.
like TCP, but we experimented with Newtons that had IR and RF wireless,
Mm.
and those those are game-changing things today. So Starlink, big constellation of satellites growing, about 9,600 or so in service today. We see continuous launches, Falcon launches
Mhm.
of, you'll see an X message, 23 new or 20 something Starlink satellites launched, and it happens, I don't know, once, twice a week or something. I mean,
Yeah,
it's
at least,
pretty
yeah.
strong cadence. And then with Starship, you'll be able to do, SpaceX will be launching, 100 at a pop. So it's important that there are a lot of them, and we'll talk about why that is. So internet in the sky, something that we saw in movies and thought about, and now is quite possible. And I mean, think about this for a second. Imagine that if you're on a cruise ship, you're on an airplane, you're miles away from anything that's terrestrial, and you have the same internet connection.
Right. Right.
Uh, yeah, that's stunning.
No, it's stunning.
So let's talk about how it works. Uh, and it's so cool. I'm I'm sorry. I probably am going to repeat that uh, several times here because I'm just blown away about how this thing works and how it came together. And I know a lot of the details of it, but yet I'm still, you know, amazed that we have it. When I saw it coming, you know what I mean? Like 2 or 3 years ago, I was like, wow, this is going to change everything. And this is, we're always doing this as we start to have a love for Elon companies, and we're saying, you know,
Don't change everything.
well, we're thinking things like robotaxi will change everything, and
Right.
it's coming, and Optimus will change everything, and it's coming, and SpaceX, when it goes at Starship at regular cadence, and they get it to reusability, will change, and then there's space-based data centers are coming, but Starlink is here.
Here.
It is literally here, and it's one of those things that I remember 2 or 3 years ago that was coming. And it's a good example of why people need to really lean in and understand that when Elon looks like he's always for some people who have very pessimistic view or desire to have that view, he always looks like he's in the under promise over deliver business, right? Did I say that wrong?
No, over promise and under deliver, or deliver late at least.
Yeah. Yeah. Under promise, over deliver. Um,
No.
I did it backwards, didn't I? Think I needed more coffee today. Yeah. You would want to be in the under promise, over deliver business.
Business, yes,
Right.
that's a better way to
Sometimes
view
you're
it.
in the opposite. You are making promises and delivery seems delayed.
Yes.
So there's the latency in my brain for today. Sorry, everyone. Um, so what we always think sometimes with these companies is these things aren't showing up. They're just promises that won't be delivered. And then when they are delivered, they are literally, you know, changing, big time changing, totally disruptive. Starlink is completely a disruptive technology.
Right.
So what's it look like? It looks like, as I mentioned before, you know, a constellation of satellites, a mesh network of satellites, about give or take 10,000. There are various communications paths we're going to talk about here and how it kind of works. If you think about your device on the ground, whether it's anything that's talking to something over Starlink, and let's think of it as you subscribe to Starlink and you put a transceiver in your home. In that case, you know, in order to get the connectivity to your devices in your home from that, and then by the way, that transceiver also works with a little router that makes it like a Wi-Fi, a home-based Wi-Fi, and you know, obviously you could put Ethernet on it too if you want to, but basically you're going to think of it as there's two wireless networks going on here. One is your Wi-Fi, which is just a local-based delivery of data, and then of course the greater Starlink network here. So your transceiver is in constant communication with the Starlink satellites, and actually is constantly moving between them, and we'll talk about that. And then in order for you to communicate, and we'll talk about how that works, your data must travel to that satellite, to a satellite, and then the satellite must bring it down to a ground station. And a ground station is much like a oversized Starlink terminal, if you will, because it's taking a lot of data it's relaying data to the internet at large.
Mm-hmm.
So if you were to try to communicate with someone over Starlink in your home, you'd be first talking through your Wi-Fi to the routing point. Then the Starlink transceiver would take over, move the data to the satellite. The satellite would find a ground station to talk to, send your data there, and then you would hit the target destination, whatever that is, whether it's a web server, another user, and then it would repeat in the opposite direction, right? So you're think of it as send receive, and in certain instances, what happens is the ground stations are not available to the Starlink satellite that you are actually talking to. And there's reasons for that. Some are geopolitical and some are just, you know, geography based. Like where's the ground-based station if you're in the middle of the Atlantic?
Right.
Where is the ground station if you're in Tehran? The answer is they're further away at some ground point. And so the satellites also can intercommunicate using these laser links called ISLs, inter-satellite links. So that's an optical link between the satellites. And so think of the Starlink as a mesh network, and it's all cooperatively working together. Your transceiver bonds or connects to a specific satellite and can be handed off to another. Satellites are moving
seamlessly,
hand off every 15 seconds to the next in the link. And that's pretty typical. I mean, sometimes they're held back. I believe there's been some data on how, if you know, basically what's happening is there's the handover isn't really just a time-based thing. It's a signal. So it first can locate, you know, sort of like let's say the terminal itself has an almanac, knows where the satellites are supposed to be. They're very predictable orbits, and can use its location to know what to, like if it's on a cold boot, to know what to look for. And then once it connects to one satellite, it's monitoring its signal quality to that satellite and can jump over to a neighboring satellite and may do so every 15 seconds. Okay. So that means that you basically have a continuous connection, but you're jumping satellites rather quickly. And a good way to think of this is sort of the opposite of the way a cellular network works in a sense, because in a cellular network, let's say you're driving, you're the moving object.
Yeah.
And there are these cell towers, and let's just say, for example, that they're a mile apart. And so what happens is you bond to the local one, the one that's closest, you connect to the one that's closest to you. And then as you start to move towards the next one, it becomes clear that the device knows that the signal strength is increasing on the next one, and it will drop. It's a slower move. I mean, you dynamically, you're not moving as quickly as the satellites are moving away from the transceiver. So, but Starlink's a bit different because the satellites themselves are moving. It's like the cell towers in motion, and the least dynamic object is you. Even if you're on an airplane,
Right.
You're the least dynamic object, even if you're going at 500 miles an hour over, ground based. So basically, you're swapping through these satellites, and what happens is that each of these transceivers uses a technology, and we'll talk a little bit more about, called beamforming. And so each of these transceivers, if you were to peel back the surface layer, you would actually see that it's a grid of I believe about 1,280 antennas below, and those antennas are all able to use a technique called beamforming to aggregate the beam and speak to a specific satellite and bend the beam to talk to that satellite as it moves. And that's really extraordinary piece of technology.
Yeah.
So that's the, kind of high level architecture here. Just repeating, we have a big grid of satellites. We need to. They're at low Earth orbit. They're about 500 kilometers or 350 miles over our head. And that is why we need so many, because their cone, if you think about their cone, their beam can only be so wide.
Right.
So the further they are up, the wider the beam or the cone would be. But the problem, of course, is the further they're up, they introduce latency, which we're going to talk about. So they need to be low Earth orbit to make this possible, to make the latency portion of the connection low. And that's an extremely important part of this. It almost is defining in a way.
Now, I think some people have talked about maybe at some point, some of these satellites might be at higher orbit, but then whatever they're doing would then transmit by laser to the low Earth orbit. So you basically still get your latency by virtue of being able to make that laser transmission.
Yeah. So if we look at recent news, all the discussion's been about Elon talking about building a space-based data center.
Right.
And a space-based data center is also a satellite constellation, and it is at a higher orbit and in a sun-facing orbit because it's an energy consuming, and it's more energy consuming, and its purpose is to compute, particularly to do inference compute, but yet its entire purpose is to communicate to terrestrial Earthlings that want to do inference-based AI operations, right? Whatever that is, whether it's generative or talking to, an AI. For example, if you're in your car and you're talking to Grok, you may be talking to a Grok inference instance that is literally on a satellite that is at higher orbit than these Starlink satellites. But you're going through the Starlink satellite to get to them. And to your point, the ISLs, the inter-satellite links by these laser links, would be employed from the higher orbit data center satellites to the lower orbit Starlink satellites. And that's how it would come together as, in other words, you're effectively able to communicate to these to these higher orbit satellites, and essentially it creates a much larger mesh. So the transceiver on the ground is not talking directly to the data center satellites. They'd be talking through Starlink.
Right.
And definitionally, like what I mean by that is there really is unlikely to be any other type of pathway to those higher, because they would not necessarily take those satellites that higher Earth orbit and put the RF, beamforming antennas on those things. They don't need to. They just need the laser links.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So so I could have drawn another diagram here where
Another layer.
another layer. But it's I'm glad you brought that up, because it's sort of definitional there as well. In other words, in order to create that next layer appropriately, to keep the latency low and to enable it at a cost efficient way, you want those the satellites that are part of the data center grid to be compute based, not comm based.
Right. Right.
Whereas the Starlink satellites are principally comm based. So cool.
Yep.
This is cool. We're going to talk about how it puts data on the wire, so to speak. And in this case, when we talk about the wire, we're talking about an RF signal. And you might wonder, well, how is it encoding this data? Like, what's going on here? And it's using this, what's called methodology called 64 QAM, quadrature amplitude modulation. Okay. This is a common type of data encoding scheme that is used by cellular phones to move data. It's used by Wi-Fi. So it's well understood if you're trying to encode data on an RF signal. So remember, what we have here is we have an RF signal, which is largely an analog signal between the antenna, Starlink terminal, we'll call it a transceiver because it transmits and receives, right? And the satellite itself, which is also a transceiver because it transmits and receives, but it's propagating an RF signal, which is an analog signal. And so what we can do is we can, in certain little teeny windows of time, we can modify the amplitude of and phase of the wave. So amplitude would be the height of the wave, and phase would be how it's shifted off of zero, right? 0 degrees. And if we can do that in these small windows of time, and those windows of time for Starlink are 10 nanoseconds. So for every 10 nanoseconds, each of these little antennas can change its amplitude and phase. And when it does, it encodes 6 bits worth of data. So everybody's familiar, data that's transmitted is just ones and zeros.
Right.
And we typically think, we say, oh, well, that, there's a byte worth of data. Well, that's 8 bits. Well, this is 6 bits. This is, 64 QAM is a 6-bit model, and there are others. And that means that, that effectively there are what is called 64 symbols. And you can look at that little chart on the right, and you can see the 2 axes of where you have amplitude modulation and phase modulation. And then based on the amplitude, the discrete amplitude and phase modulation, you end up with, you're in a place, you're in one of these little blue dots. And if you're in one of these blue dots for 10 milliseconds, you're transmitting that number. So let's say you were on the far upper left one, it stood there for that, at that amplitude and that phase shift, that would transmit the number 000100. And then all these and so what happens is, that amounts to, by the way, for 10 nanoseconds per lock on an amplitude and phase, it gives us 90 million symbols a second, which if you calculate it, so each symbol represents 6 bits of data. So if you calculate it, that means that the theoretical link limit is 540 megabits per second. Now, does that all make sense? You know,
Well, as much sense as it can make to it to
yeah,
someone who isn't in that world. But yeah,
yeah,
so it's very, very, very large amounts of data being transmitted extremely fast.
yeah.
Um,
So,
and the fascinating part, of course, is your previous slide. To me, the fascinating part is the previous slide where we're talking about from my phone to the transceiver to the satellite, which is also a transceiver, down to a base station, off to whatever it's going to do in terms of the cloud or whatever, or to another person that needs to talk to, and then all of that reverses and is done in real time.
yep.
I
Yeah.
was like,
So,
really?
so to summarize this, every 10 nanoseconds of time,
Yeah,
the terminal is able to shift the phase and the amplitude of the RF signal
right,
to encode one of these little teeny blue dots,
right,
which represents a number based on
right.
this little table.
Hmm.
Okay. So, in other words, each side knows what this table looks like,
Right,
right? In order to do 64
right.
QAM, each side understands that if the phase is this
Hmm.
and the amplitude is this, it equals this number.
Right.
And then you just pull those numbers together. And so that amounts to 90 million symbols a second. And each symbol represents 6 bits. So if you do the math, that's 540 megabits per second link. Now,
Right.
what's important? So, but because most of the conversation, so in that window of time, the terminal gets to decide how much of that 540 megabits is shared for uplink and how much is shared or shared between uplink and downlink.
Hmm. Hmm.
And they bias it towards downlink because we've seen this in our home internet type of thing where it's like what's your downlink or what's your
Oh, yeah.
what's your received speed as in terms of
Hmm.
download speed versus
Hmm.
upload, and
Hmm.
download's important because most of the time
Most
you're
of the data. Hmm.
so what they do is they bias this they take out of a second, which is 1,000 milliseconds, right?
Hmm.
74 of those 1,000 they use for upload,
Hmm.
and 926, the remaining, they use
Hmm.
for download.
Hmm.
And so it's what would refer to as an asymmetric link. Now, I believe that they can dynamically shift that. So they can change that depending on the type of data that's moving. Perhaps I'm not actually
Hmm.
sure, but it's theoretically actually quite possible to vary the to. But that requires uh, when you think about this data transmitting, uh, it's what we would say in networking. It's framed. So there's sort of and I talk about it in the article. There's an outer framing that's like a control signal that's telling it certain things, and some of the messages are purely control. So there could be a control message that says switch your bias in terms of upload to download link, in terms of to change the symmetry of the link dynamically. So in other words, download capacity is prioritized for the
Sure.
consumer.
Sure.
But that's different in like I've heard deployments on I've heard about like uh, these cruise ships that have these 10 megabit Starlink, specialized commercial terminals, and that they're symmetric, meaning that it's like 5 up, 5 down, or
Hmm.
gigabit. So, 5 up, 5 down, uh, so that you have a symmetric link as opposed to one that's more like a home-based internet link.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry if I confuse anybody, but basically this is pretty cool.
No,
It
no,
basically
no, I understand it.
this is how the data flows.
So this is the same. This is the same as my relationship with my wife.
Hmm.
There's a lot more when I give a little bit of data, she gives me a lot more data back.
Yeah. And is her data, well, we won't climb into your marriage. But this is, if we drop below, this is what's going on.
Hmm.
This is
Hmm.
what's going on. This is how,
Right.
you take this RF signal, this radio frequency signal, which is analog, then how do you get binary data
Yeah.
encoded in there? And you get it by just defining a symbol related to an amplitude and phase of the antenna.
Sure.
So that's how this works. And that
Yeah.
it's known in the industry as QAM and this particular encoding, because there are others.
Mhm.
There are higher end ones. I believe 5G is higher. 5G cellular is higher. I think it's like 256 QAM. I could be wrong, but the Starlink, I believe, is using 64 QAM, and they may switch too. They may move up
Mhm,
to,
mhm, mhm.
and then they might dual support. You know, on the maybe this is beyond my pay grade or knowledge, but you know, maybe the V3 Starlink satellites support a higher QAM
Right.
for those terminals that are higher, and so then that becomes a 540 megabit theoretical link goes up.
Right.
It just requires, the problem with that is it requires faster hardware, and there's a lot going on there. Just so people understand, when I say beamforming and I'm talking about the shift in amplitude and phase, there is nothing moving.
Right.
There's no physical part. There's no motors moving antennas. That's no. It's just, think of it as just bending the signal.
Yeah.
And that's why these terminals are highly reliable and pretty darn cheap,
Hmm.
because they're using this beamforming technology that doesn't require any physical motoring
Mhm, mhm.
to cause the beam to move.
Right.
Okay, cool. Does that make sense? I
Yep.
mean,
Yep.
reasonably
Yep.
so?
Yep.
Yep. Okay, so now let's talk about like what's going on here from a point of view of bandwidth and latency. And when we talk about our internet speed, what do we mean? What do we actually mean? And we're talking about two distinct things: bandwidth, which is capacity, and latency, which is delay. So if you look at my little silly AI generated picked in the lower right corner, bandwidth is like the number of lanes on the highway. It's a capacity. And when we often buy an internet service, we buy it in chunks of bandwidth, right? And that matters because larger images require, in other words, the transmit time required for a certain image relates to the capacity, the parallelism of that capacity, the number of lanes. But latency is the real interesting part here. It's the one where that's the speed of the car. That's the how fast the car is going is how quickly you can get that data. So if you can imagine those cars on the right in a traffic jam, that would be, you might have a lot of bandwidth, but the latency is so high that you don't get a lot of throughput.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, so that's important to understand. And latency in terms of Starlink, the latency is mostly related to a physics problem, which is the transmission of data is kind of governed by the speed of light.
Right.
Because if you think of the RF signal transmitting in a vacuum, an RF signal moves effectively at the speed of light.
Mhm.
Now, in case of Starlink, it's not really a vacuum. You're going through an atmosphere of Earth until you get to pretty much zero atmosphere, pretty much to a vacuum.
Mhm,
But
mhm.
starting at you've got a pretty saturated, so it's not exactly the speed of light. But if we look at like say optical fiber, right? Optical fiber, if you try to move data between San Francisco and New York, it's roughly 2,500 miles, give or take. Um, it moves data. This is optics, right? This is pretty fast stuff. It's effectively speed of light, but in an optical fiber, it runs at about 66% of speed of
Mhm,
light.
mhm, mhm.
And that means that in order to move data one direction, one small piece of data, one byte of data, actually one bit of data, it requires 13 milliseconds to go from San Francisco to New York.
Okay.
And that means the round trip time, meaning go
Yeah.
back and forth, would be 26 milliseconds. That's what RTT is, round trip time.
Mhm.
And that ignores something we'll call routing. But what's important to recognize here is that's fast. And by the way, millisecond is a thousandth of a second,
Right.
right? So So when you get up to, when somebody says 500 milliseconds, that's a half a second.
Right.
Or 750 milliseconds is 3/4 of a second.
Mhm.
1,000 is a second. So 13 milliseconds is 13 thousandths of a second. Right. So now let's translate this into what's going on with Starlink. If we look at these other types of previous networks like 𝐄𝐦𝐚𝐲 and this Globalstar, I believe, these are satellites that are at 20,000 miles above Earth, 35,000 kilometers. And so now, if we think about this whole idea, let's use a theoretical limit of the speed of light transfer. We incur a delay, a round trip time delay, and I'll explain why it's computed this way, of 476 milliseconds. That's a lot. That's almost a half a second, right? So 500 would be a half a second. So any communications done across this incurs this latency, whether we can't do anything about it. It's a physics problem. We don't know how to break the speed of light. So this is what you would get with Globalstar, I think. And what we do here is we say the path is four times this, because the path means that, think about what's happening here. From the transceiver on the ground in your house, the Starlink one, whether it's Starlink, you're talking to Globalstar, it doesn't really matter. You still have the same problem. You have to move the data to the satellite. It has to move it to ground. It's got to then go somewhere else, come back, move from ground back to transceiver. So it's four. Every round trip is four. So you have to compute that distance to that satellite and multiply it by 4 to get the effective latency, and what we would say effective minimum latency, right? This is not, there are other latencies involved. I will mention them, but this is the primary link latency. Now, if we look at Starlink's LEO-based low Earth orbit satellites, they're running approximately 500 kilometers, 300-ish miles above our heads. And if we multiply those by 4, we get 2,000 kilometers. And if we do the math, that's 7 milliseconds. So it's 65 times better to talk to a Starlink satellite than it is to these geosynchronous orbit at large, previous 20,000 mile satellites. There's the advantage. Now, the problem is you got to have a lot more. As we discussed, it's sort of, you have them lower, you have less of a cone of. So, I mean, think about that. This is super, super important, because while you could have, we talked about data encoding, we talked about a theoretical limit of 540 megabits per second. But if we have a high latency, it means that we delay the time that we move the data. And there are some things that require very, very low latency. And a good example is our conversation here over Zoom. If we increase this latency to half a second, this conversation doesn't flow. We're doing a real-time so video between, a video connection, not like not like you're watching Netflix. That's fine. It can incur latency. It doesn't really matter. But real-time video, like what we're doing here, FaceTime, would require very, very low latency. Gaming, multiplayer gaming, different types of applications, anything that remote controls something. My God, imagine, so many discussions about remote controlling autonomous cars or, this kind of garbage that you can imagine if that latency is up just a slight bit, and a car is traveling at a certain speed, to try to control that car at 60 miles an hour. I'm not doing the math here live, but would be probably too much latency to remote control anything like that. So Starlink completely wins by changing the orbit dynamics. It's a physics problem. It's unbreakable, at least in current physics we know about, and so it deals with that by creating a fairly high bandwidth link. And by the way, that bandwidth over time will get much, much larger. Much, much larger. We're used to that in our Comcast connections over and competitive style connections, land-based terrestrial connections. Over time, we've gotten 1 gigabit service or something like that. But we'll see the same thing happen here with Starlink over time. But we really can't break the latency barrier, and 7 milliseconds is a minimum. Oh, I should mention there are other latencies in this equation that, I think people talk about Starlink having a minimum latency of like 26, 23, 26 milliseconds. You might add, well, wait, Phil just said 7. What's wrong here? How do you, well, when you're moving data, uh, whenever you're moving data around, there's going to be little latencies. So whenever you're when the satellite Starlink satellite gets the data, and it holds it for the briefest amount of time, so it can pile it into a downlink, window. Because remember, it's got to then talk to a ground-based station. Every time it holds that or queues that data, people would call it queuing.
Uh-huh.
That process of queuing is taking the data that's coming from your transceiver, holding it in memory for the briefest amount of time, and then pushing it down. And sometimes it can't push it down. It has to push it to another satellite, which may have to relay it to another satellite. So now those optical links, those laser links between satellites are super fast, but just if you take data from one satellite and move it to another, it's sitting on a queue. It's sitting in a line waiting to get like pushed. So all of that requires or incurs is the right word, incurs a higher latency.
Right.
25, 23, 25 milliseconds, pretty darn good.
Yeah.
If you were to look at your latency on your Comcast link, it's quite comparable.
Okay.
So that's super important. So when anybody talks about Starlink, the most important element of why we do this, why it's LEO, why these satellites are 300 miles and not 20,000 miles, is because we need to reduce latency to make this service work. Okay, cool.
All right.
So now let's talk about the future here of Starlink. Starlink's going to invade our mobile phones.
Right.
And how exactly they do it, I'm not here to predict. But today we think of Starlink as, these small flat transceiver dishes that we buy that we can set up. And some people have, there's the mini and there's the regular terminal. The mini, I guess, can be mobile. In other words, you can put it in your car. Certainly there's different style terminals for commercial interconnects.
Sure.
Like what's on a United plane, what's on a cruise ship, to aggregate and to create higher bandwidth connections. But that's different than cellular, right? And cellular phones, using various standards, communicate their digital data using, at the base level, they're using this QAM technique we talked about, encoding data, but it's a very different protocol and antenna design. And there's the physical and a logical aspect of this, but it's very different than these little transceivers. And you can't imagine, your phone couldn't have a Starlink transceiver on it. You couldn't you couldn't pull together 1280 antennas on the back of your iPhone and have it, turn it towards the sky and all of a sudden have it, So for if you wanted to communicate to cell phones on standard cell phone protocols at the physical you have to emulate cell towers. And effectively what Starlink is able to do is emulate cell towers on the satellites themselves. And are they close enough? Like a cell tower might be a mile away or 2 miles or up to 25 miles away from you when you're, moving or what have you. Well, they're close, but not that close. They're 300 miles away. So what we noticed that has happened is that they have talked about, SpaceX has talked about direct to cell, and they have that service kind of limping along to be able to do sort of like SMS, but not voice and not heavy data. But but we can see a path here. We can see a very, very clear path here, and we know that there's a path here because Starlink, SpaceX, in fact, trademarked Starlink Mobile as if it's going to be a carrier itself.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we know that they made a spectrum acquisition.
Right.
The EchoStar, they spent $17 billion to acquire the spectrum that's in the range of LTE 5G, right? So now that means that the hardware of, say, an iPhone needs to be modified in some particular ways. I'm not too super clear on what has to happen and changes in antenna and some other things to enable that spectrum to connect to it. But I think we can see a day where our cell phones using their native hardware for cellular connects to a Starlink cellular network as if it was a terrestrial based network. And what's really stunning about this, if we understand the dynamics of what's going on here, is this now could enable very, very rural access.
Right.
I mean, like Antarctica.
Right.
Use of your cell phone in a very normal, native way, as if, yeah. And so I mentioned, on the ocean, disaster areas, conflict zones, super rural. Now, it may not be great for very dense urban environments per se, but it certainly wins in the rural beyond measure because, we all know that there's huge gaps in cellular on planet Earth, massive gaps. We don't think of them because we're always driving in places where, based on use, the cellular carriers are keeping ahead of us.
But we all know about the dead zones.
There are, well, I mean, if you look at a map of planet Earth, you would see that, I don't know, I'm just going to say 90% of the actual physical coverage of Earth is not covered by cellular. That someone's going to tell me that number is radically wrong.
But I'm talking about the dead zone just down the street.
Oh, down the street, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I have my own problems in my neighborhood, but this is where we can see that Starlink as a service is not just about what we think of it today, and that we can see it expand to cover these more proper, I mean, proper, more well-known LTE 5G standards, and what's interesting about that is that when I said that earlier in the discussion, when I said Optimus would be connected through Starlink, I didn't mean necessarily through a classic Starlink terminal, layered into its head. It may just be a 5G chip.
Right.
Same thing with cars.
Right.
I mean, think about it today. Our Tesla cars have 5G connectivity to a carrier, and Tesla pays a lot of money to that carrier. Tesla tries to minimize that connection, but real-time map updates and routing and different types of streaming music service to the car, all that's got to go over that link.
Yeah.
And then they're paying for that link. And when it's, if you're paying like connectivity premium where you're doing, you, the consumer, are using the link, that's one thing. But remember, Tesla wants to do things like shift data to the cloud, or that's why they hold that data principally back for a Wi-Fi connection, because it's too expensive to do it. And imagine a combined company between SpaceX and Tesla, all of a sudden having effectively zero incremental cost for having data on their very devices. And if you think about 1 billion Optimuses running around the planet, you can see why that matters.
Yeah, it really matters.
And then if Elon and companies ever attempt to make a cell phone, now we talked about that ad nauseum about building a device that's like a local inference device,
right?
But that thing would obviously want to connect through Starlink.
So yeah,
this is a big deal, and I don't know exactly strategically where it's going to go and when different services will come out, but they've got the high bandwidth side covered, and then you might want to call this the low bandwidth side, but uh, you know, there'll be a player here too.
Yeah.
And I'm
Yeah.
not necessarily suggesting that, T-Mobile and AT&T are doomed, but it is possible.
Right. Well, in the meantime, I think T-Mobile is the first one to get
Right.
the direct
Right.
to cell.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of carrier relationships here where the essentially what Starlink is doing is really just adding cell towers to the
Right.
network that
Right.
may exist on someone's existing T-Mobile connection,
Yeah.
right? So in other words, effectively giving T-Mobile customers rural or ocean-based access to their phone, but they're really using Starlink, and it's just transparent to you, the user, that
Yeah.
that's happening. Uh, so yeah, cool, huh?
Yeah. I very much like it. Yeah. So
Okay,
this is quite interesting.
okay. Last cool slide.
Okay.
What happens when we go beyond Earth? Um, so Elon has talked about something called Mars Link more than
Yeah.
once,
Yeah.
and I don't think he's talked about Moon Link. But what's super interesting about this is that, obviously SpaceX kind of prime purpose was to get off of Earth and move
To Mars.
to Mars. And now Elon said, well, we're going to shift a bit towards the moon strategy. Frankly, I don't think it's what people think. I don't think that's like, oh, geez, I'm deprioritizing
Right.
Mars. He's just sort of in a way slotting it in as an extra thing. It's not really like 100% strategy shift if you read between the lines. But he's saying here's the practicalities to it, and he sees as SpaceX is probably going to be a public company, he sees great advantage of joining into the Artemis program and becoming Moonbase Alpha. So, but let's look at what this takes to do this. If we talk about something like Mars Link, this is, a satellite-based Starlink version for Mars.
Hmm.
Uh, let's just talk about that for a second. What would that look like? Well, it would look like something that would be necessary, right? Right today, Starlink competes with the terrestrial internet service providers and so forth. But Mars doesn't have those things. And no one's going to bury fiber in Mars, at least maybe from uh, building one to building two.
Yeah. Yeah.
But they're most certainly not going to cover Mars, at least in any proximal time we're talking about here, uh, to cover Mars with a bunch of optical fiber. And in fact, the only way to do this would be through satellite-based internet connectivity. And I say internet because that's another thing we'll get into. But so in other words, it becomes the actual effectively comm backbone or internet backbone for Mars. Like
Hmm.
it's got to exist. If you're going to colonize Mars, you have to do this, or you
Right.
will want to do this, and you
Yes.
will do this.
Yes.
Now, there's some heavy, crazy things here that, if we talk about Mars specifically, we usually talk about the distance to Mars being in something called astronomical units, which is related to, it's a little chart at the bottom. It's basically 92 million miles. It's a measurement between here and the sun,
Mm-hmm.
Earth to the sun. I guess it's the average distance, but it's a unit called 1 AU.
Hmm.
So interestingly enough, if we think about we were talking about latency it was really important. Well, guess what, people? It really is important because if we try to talk to Mars in real time, that's a non-starter. Mars has an orbit related to Earth that at its minimum would make a round trip latency be over 8 minutes, and at a maximum 44 minutes, and an
44.
average of 25 minutes.
Okay.
So if I said hello 8 minutes later,
Right.
and there is no way to change that.
Yeah. The speed
Okay,
of
that's
light. Yeah.
yeah. So what does that mean? It means that we cannot we cannot have a service on Mars that allows someone living on Mars to talk to somebody on Earth in real time.
Right.
We can build video messages. We can do all sorts of data buffering, and in a sense, some of the hard engineering work is how do we link Earth to Mars through this? And we know that what Mars Link would be is there would be several other higher orbit satellites that would manage these ISLs, these laser links between, and then they would relay data.
Yeah.
So there would be this whole idea of data from Earth being buffered, relayed. So you've got like all this heavy caching of data that gets stored and forwarded to Mars. And obviously that can be communications. It just can't be real-time communications. You
Right.
can't
Right.
play a real-time game with somebody that's on Mars.
Right.
You can't do a FaceTime conversation to somebody that's on Mars. So there's more to the problem than just propping up a similar analogous Starlink
Sure.
mesh network across Mars. To make it interconnect to Earth requires some magical protocols that people there's a lot written on this, by the way. Actually, there's a
Sure.
lot of protocols have been developed to deal with these high latency links effectively. Now, so now Elon's been talking about the moon, so we may as well say, well, what about the moon?
Yeah.
You know, well, moon's as ripe for its version of a Starlink network as Mars is. Now the good news is the moon is closer,
Yeah.
roughly about its round trip time is roughly 2.6 seconds. So that's sort of think of that as the minimum latency. So could we have this conversation between here and the moon live? Yeah, but it'd be weird.
Yeah.
I mean, a 2 second delay is pretty
Yeah.
weird.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's the kind of,
But
speed of light.
we've all had that in our lifetime.
Yeah, and no, I mean, these things can, believe me, these things, if at scale, these things can be augmented in terms of how the user interface is designed. Like certainly, kind of, if you're using iMessage between
Mhm.
uh, somebody on Earth and somebody on the moon,
Mhm.
it would feel fairly real time.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
people couldn't tell. If you're doing a voice connection, it's very, very different and very difficult.
But again, we've had this in our lifetime
Yeah,
where we've
but
just had to pause and wait for the thing to finish, and then we.
right. So that's what I was saying. At scale, you can imagine someone developing some good user interface artifacts that
Yeah.
allow people not to talk over each other and
Right.
allow
Right.
people to have a reasonable way of my window of time to talk is, and
Yeah.
um, and of course, again, the same type of thing. You're talking about a laser link between these satellites that are in the orbit of Moon to the satellites that are in the orbit of Earth, and perhaps in this case, there's no relay satellites needed. I don't know. I mean, I'm not here to engineer this problem, but between Mars, it looks like you'd have a higher Earth orbit. Sorry, yeah, maybe Earth orbit or Mars orbit satellites or Sun orbit satellites that have to be the relay links.
Right.
Between the planets. But I will say this about this, as fanciful and crazy as this sounds, if the moon and that planet are in fact inhabited by people from Earth, us, this will happen.
Yeah. Yeah. For sure.
It's not really like an optional thing.
Right. Right.
This will actually happen.
Yeah.
And can happen and would be desirable to happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's cool, huh?
Pretty wild. Pretty wild. The
Yeah.
future is getting here faster than anybody thought it would, I think.
And that's all I got.
That's all you got, huh? Well, that
Yeah.
was pretty good.
I would encourage folks in my article list on X, my X handles in the bottom left corner here at Beisel. There is that article right there. Starlink is mind blowing.
Right.
And I really think it'd be great to read it because it's, where I screwed up the conversation many times today. The article does a better job.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
And while it was published in 2014 before. I mean, I was thinking about updating it, but in some ways it doesn't need updating. I read it
Yeah,
through this morning, and I was like, well, I don't think there's anything in error here.
yeah, yeah.
There's just some things that have moved along in terms of number of satellites deployed and customers. And I mean, look at that customer number. There's a reason why we're having this
Yeah,
conversation.
yeah, exactly.
Um,
Exactly.
this thing is, and I think the thing that's interesting about this, Randy, is that I, as I mentioned earlier in the conversation years ago, I
Mhm.
looked at this and I said, this will change everything.
Yeah, yeah.
This will change how just as wireless, both local based wireless like
Right.
Wi-Fi,
Mhm.
and of course, much more broader based wireless like cellular, has changed our relationship with how we communicate. And I don't want to say just the internet, I mean,
Yeah,
because
yeah, yeah.
how we communicate. Starlink enables that too. I have a friend, a very good friend, close friend, and he has retired and he lives on a sailboat. And currently he's in New Zealand. Last month he was in Fiji. And I have had FaceTime conversations with
Right,
him while he was between
right.
Fiji and New Zealand,
Yeah.
because he has in fact Starlink on his boat.
Yes.
Uh,
And only 12 years ago, 13 years ago, I can remember taking my son to a football game in Las Vegas where we were halfway between Los Angeles and Las Vegas and being so impressed that we were able to get Wi-Fi in the middle of the desert.
yeah, I mean it's absolutely it's a game changer,
It
to know
is.
that any
It's
place on Earth you can connect, any place on Earth, any place above Earth,
right.
on the oceans,
Yeah.
on your United flight, on soon to be Southwest, soon to be everybody apparently except for
Right, right,
Ryanair.
right. Yeah. Oh, except who? Oh,
I
yeah,
said except
right.
for Ryanair. Everybody listening must know what that
Yes,
means.
yes, right, right.
No, I mean,
If you don't, ask Gronk.
Ryanair will fall too.
That's
Uh,
right. That's right.
just like, can you imagine? Can you really imagine going to a neighbor's or friend's house and not having them be on Wi-Fi? I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
honestly,
exactly.
like, like it's what are the utilities in your home? Well, you have water, you have gas, you have
Right,
electric, and you have internet, right?
right.
And of course, that internet is manifest through a wireless technology called Wi-Fi, and most people would generically assume that the only thing that is the barrier to their entry to your Wi-Fi is the Wi-Fi password, and that's about it,
That's
right?
right.
So I mean, as I said earlier in this conversation, we look at a lot of these Elon things, and we see that UPod is flipped in many people's minds. It's like, geez, he's overpromising and under-delivering. See, I
Mhm.
I got it right this time.
Mhm, mhm.
And reality is the things he's going after are big, hard, and very, very physical problems. I think that's
Yes.
something that needs to be said here. You can go off and build Google Gemini. You just need a big data center, and the data center, obviously, Google had to build it, and they had
Yeah.
to build the model, and they had, there's really a lot of hard work there. But to build a fleet of at scale Optimus bots, to build a robotaxi network, uh, and to build a internet in the sky service. These are all physical deployments that
Right.
require. I mean, for God's sakes, we know that Elon's a good at manufacturing. Well, remember what's going on here with Starlink. Um, this means that SpaceX is the largest manufacturer of satellites on Earth
Oh, yeah, by far, by not
by
even
far. I mean,
not even close.
by
Yeah.
it's probably 95% of all
Right.
satellites are
Right.
built because they're all Starlink satellites, and that's the mass deployment of satellites, and we've talked about this before. I mean, there are onesie twosie satellites in
Right.
defense, and some GPS satellites here and there, and some other comm-based satellites that get launched, but Starlink at roughly a fleet or a grid or a mesh of 10,000 of them growing. By the way, I believe the projected state here is 40,000 Starlink satellite,
That's one of the mid range.
mid-range.
Now we've got the 144,000, then the million, and then the
Okay.
billion. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's yeah, that's why when Elon talks about space-based data center, he's talking about this, million
Right.
deployed satellite
Right.
grid at a higher orbit. That, when you start to think about that, the barrier to entry from others is manufacturing a million satellites, not
Yeah.
well,
Yeah. Yeah.
and launching them.
Among
But
other things. Yeah. Right.
yeah, I mean, yeah, there is this among other things, but I'm saying is if you just kind of narrow it down
Yeah. Yeah.
to a
Yeah.
single thing and you think about, so what Elon does is in many of his companies, they are it's very interesting. It's like in a way he's taking this sort of like the tech of AI, and this isn't really, by the way, AI will invade this in a very, very big way.
Sure.
We the next generation terminals will probably adapt their protocol dynamics and how they switch upstream and downstream links and how they encode data using an AI model as
Hmm.
opposed to right now it's a very strictly coded
Sure. Sure.
type of thing, and I suspect that Starlink terminals in the future will be little mini inference devices and probably having a AI 5 or 6 chip on them, and that's how they'll do most of their connection protocol through a well understood but AI augmented kind of model. Yeah.
Okay, Phil. Well, listen, that was exactly what I was hoping for today. It's a way, it's like so educational, so helpful, and we'll look forward to this future that's just breaking on us so fast. So, as
Cool.
usual, I want to thank you for joining me, and to all of you folks out there, it's been great talking to you.